Give the slides, please. I don't know if you saw this film, Maxed Out. It's a story of credit card debt in the United States. There are many dimensions to this problem, but one important dimension is a statute called the Bankruptcy Abuse Prevention and Consumer Protection Act of 2005. This is a little bit of a typo. There's no consumer protection in this act at all. But the effect of this statute was to render it effectively impossible for people to discharge their credit card debts. So whereas Bethlehem Steel can escape pension obligations through bankruptcy, or Enron can escape the obligation to deliver power, you literally cannot escape your credit card obligations if you're a lower middle class American. You will carry these obligations forever. Now, this idea was first proposed in the administration of President Bill Clinton, and he was originally in favor of it. And then his wife read an op-ed in the New York Times, and she started speaking of that, quote, awful bill, with a small b, that is. And she's credited with single-handedly keeping this bill from becoming law to her great credit, so to speak. But this bill, like Jason in Friday the 13th, would not go away. So in 2001, it returned. So there's been extraordinary change here. I don't mean the change of this man. There's been change here since this man, President Clinton, left office. Change in Washington described in this extraordinary book by Robert Kaiser, change in lobbying, changing in the economy of influence in lobbying in just the past 12 years. This economy, of course, has components: lobbyists benefiting members, benefiting special interests, benefiting lobbyists. Each of these pays the other. So think about the way lobbyists pay members. There are two ways here: during the membership of a member of Congress and after the membership of a member of Congress. So during, lobbyists pay with cash, and I don't mean cash in brown paper bags. They pay by supporting the campaigns. As the campaign costs have exploded, members who spend somewhere between 30 and 70% of their time raising money become increasingly dependent upon these lobbyists as suppliers of the money they need to run for office. The level here is something new. As Kaiser writes, money has been part of American politics forever, on occasion in the Gilded Age or the Harding administration, for example, much more blatantly than recently. But the scale of it has just gotten way out of hand. The money may have come in brown paper bags in earlier eras, but the politicians needed and took much less of it than they take through more formal channels today. They need more, they take much more. They are dependent upon that money during their time in office. But after, too, the lobbyists pay with a future. As my friend Jim Cooper describes it, Washington has become a farm league for K Street. Members, staffers, and bureaucrats increasingly have a common business model. It is focused on life after government. It is focused on life as a lobbyist. As the Public Citizen described, counting senators between 1998 and 2004, 50% left the Senate to go become lobbyists, 42% of members of the House. Everyone in this city depends upon this system surviving. That's their future here. Both during and after their time as members, lobbyists pay members. And then members pay special interests. They pay these special interests in obvious ways. So Enron, after spending $2.5 million in the first 6 months of the Bush administration, avoided the regulations that might have made it possible for us to know that their business was nothing more than a fraud. Fannie and Freddie spent $900,000 in the first 6 months of last year avoiding regulations that might have made it possible for us to know the collapse that we should have expected. Hedge fund managers in 2006 spent $1.3 million avoiding regulations that would have let us know that this whole financial system was about to collapse. This money gets spent to bend policy to those who pay for the lobbyists. And in this extraordinary study at the University of Kansas, they discovered the return on investment for lobbyist dollars spent to pass the American Jobs Creation Act was over 22,000%. Return to the people who spent money to change policy. This is how members then pay the interests. And then the interests obviously pay the lobbyists, as Kaiser describes. In earlier generations, enterprising young men came to Washington looking for power and political adventure, often with ambitions to save or reform the country or the world. In the last fourth of the 20th century, such aspirations were supplanted by another familiar American yearning: to get rich. As Kaiser describes, this industry is a $9 to $12 billion industry every year. That's bigger than the recording industry. And this man, Gerald Cassidy, built a fortune of more than $100 million on the industry which he helped reform. Industry's interests pay lobbyists. Now, this is an economy. We have to understand it as an economy of influence that has extraordinary consequences for our democracy, fundamentally bending policy. From the esoteric areas that I spent a decade studying copyright to fundamental areas like global warming, which today we have still done nothing to address. Every single issue you care about is fundamentally affected by this economy, an economy of corruption. And by corruption, I don't mean the corruption of feathering their nest. I don't mean the Abramoff or the Randy Duke Cunningham or the Rob Blagojevich corruption. I mean a corruption we could call a good soul's corruption. A corruption of legal acts, even ethical acts, that corrupt by corrupting both the policies that Washington enacts and more fundamentally destroying the faith that people have in their government. Now, one way, and in my view, increasingly, I think, the only way to address this corruption is an idea a Republican had 102 years ago, Teddy Roosevelt, something we could call citizens funding of the nation's elections, or in a Barack Obama font, it would look like that. Citizens funding of the nation's election, which has been introduced in Congress this term under something called the Fair Elections Now Act, but has nothing to do with fairness. In my view, this should be called the Trustworthy Government Now Act, because it's about restoring trust in our government. This statute would say congressmen get money to run for office in two ways: either from citizens directly in contributions no more than $100, or from citizens indirectly through the Treasury after certain mileposts are passed and the candidate demonstrates viability. Now, the point to recognize is that only a change like this could restore the faith that people have in their government by breaking any plausible link between money and results. And only this change could end the distortions which are built into our system right now. The conservatives love to talk about merits-based decisions. I want to talk about merits-based legislation that we possibly could have if we could remove this dependency from how Washington functions.